Controlling the Human Mind, the Technologies of Political Control or Tools for Peak Performance. Nick Begich has appeared on thousands of radio interviews and dozens of TV documentaries worldwide. Nick, thanks for coming on tonight.
Hey, thanks for having me, Alex. It's good to be with you. And, this is, I think, one of the most important issues that we certainly covered in covering technologies over the last 12 or 13 years. The idea of controlling the mind for beneficial or other purposes is really a lot of material out there, a lot more than we expected as we began to write this story.
Nick, I've wanted to have you on the show for some time, but I've of course been busy covering issues with Iraq and 9/11 and surveillance and other related issues, the downfall of the economy. But I think the things that you've talked about are more understandable to the average Joe or Jane, considering what's public now about electromagnetic weapons and similar forms of technology that can actually be used to control a person's mind. Now explain to us who have never even heard of this concept before or that this is possible, what we're dealing with.
Well, this technology goes back for decades, and we used over 300 sources in compiling the material. If you go back to the Korean War, which is really where the real active interest started, we had prisoners returning from the Korean conflict that just behaved totally differently than when they left, and we coined the phrase brainwashing, and then they began looking at chemical and electromagnetic and other means for influencing human behavior. By the 1960s, many of these technologies had advanced. In fact, you can look on our websites, and there's quite a bit on this topic of mind control or mind effects. In fact, even the paranormal was being looked at pretty vigorously. There's a number of declassified Defense Intelligence Agency reports in this area, but what people were after was sort of the mechanisms by which you could influence behavior. And of course, drugs got a lot of notoriety. They had been experimenting, the CIA, with these approaches, but it was the other electromagnetic means where frequency following responses were discovered, and other ideas of sort of overriding the mind with external fields for creating a number of effects started to emerge starting in the 60s and continues to this day.
Now, in terms of HAARP, Nick, is that the primary, what you would call, transmitter for some of this mind control technology, or is this just one of many other potential technological applications that are in existence today?
Well, HAARP is a multi-use facility here in Alaska, radio transmitter. It could be used for this purpose. There are much different ways to use it and use this type of technology. In fact, there's a great article called the Mind Has No Firewalls. It's the U.S. Army War College. It's in their quarterly called Perimeters. They have it online at the U.S. Army War College. But this article gets into any electromagnetic carrier can be used for carrying a signal that can influence human behavior by triggering certain areas of the mind by an external oscillation. And this is one of the things being vigorously pursued, actually continues to be pursued by the Air Force Research Laboratory. There's a great report in their publication, Horizons, Technology Horizons, Air Force Research Labs, and it's called Controlled Effects from June 2004. And it talks about developing technologies that allow you to override all of the basic senses, touch, taste, smell, sight, sound, to create very believable holograms or images or hallucinations, if you will. Pretty interesting stuff when you think about how much had to be learned to model that back to a brain, and that's essentially the state of the technology in terms of where it's headed and where it's going, presently.
Nick, I'm very impressed with your website, earthpulse.com. You have a lot of documented information there pertaining to DARPA as well.
Right. There's a lot on this subject. Even DARPA, does research for the defense agencies, and they do quite a bit in this area. There's actually an RFP that between DARPA and the research lab of the Air Force and a couple of other branches, there's a lot of research being done to look at sort of how to model this, how to recreate some of the things in terms of enhancing human performance as well as degrading it. And this gets into, the whole idea of modeling the brain, and we're getting to the point where our computing power is going to allow us some really incredible three-dimensional real-time imaging, and then being able to recreate very complex signals and feed them into other human beings. And this is the research that's been done over years, but now our resolution, if you will, our ability to tune these kinds of instruments to very fine resolution is really quickly approaching, and for many things already here. Like emotional states are relatively easy to influence. Thoughts or images, that's more complex, but we're almost there. The technologies that are right here in front of us in the next couple of years will probably already be there in terms of the open literature.
Nick, I want to take this time now and focus on one particular application of mind control that you want to talk about and discuss over the course of the next 10 minutes. Because there's a lot of information, of course, contained within your books. I guess you're in Portland here not too long ago as well, talking about these subjects.
Well, there's a couple of things. One is the whole ethical consideration. And The Economist in May 25th, 2002 actually had a cover story called The Future of Mind Control, and it was really a discussion about the ethics, the direction in which this technology should go. And when you look at the most recent literature on the subjects and sort of where it's headed, there's a RFP out right now from the Air Force, and an RFP is a request for proposal. This one doesn't close until September 30th, 2009, so it'll be active for a couple more years. And what they're looking for is a number of novel weapons incorporating biotechnology. And this is released by the Air Force Research Laboratory. And what this calls for, and I'll just read a one-line quote. It says, the ultimate goal of such research is to develop a fully articulated theory with supporting predictive models that will facilitate the inducement of desired behavioral effects in individuals and groups to the use of non-lethal weapons, unquote. And essentially, behavioral effects, controlling what you do and how you do it, using these kinds of systems, electromagnetic systems, is what the paper is about. It's about 11 pages that get into sort of this discussion of what they're looking for. And much of this has already been developed. In fact, this is where the idea of population control, pacifying civilian populations within military conflicts like what we have in Iraq, that'll be ultimately the rationale for introducing this type of technology. But yet we really have to contemplate the effect of manipulating what goes on in the human mind. Is that a place we want our militaries, our police departments, our law enforcement to go? Or is that really off limits, like biological and chemical and other weapons have been declared? The domain of the consciousness, the mind itself, that gives me great concern. It's something that I think all of us, whether we're right or left, have a understanding that thinking freely is sort of the beginning of where it all happens. And I don't think any technology should, without consent, interfere with that process.
Nick, what do you think? Why don't you think this issue is being debated right now on the floor of Congress?
Well, a lot of it is just public knowledge. I mean, in Europe, we were able to bring enough material into the European Parliament. We actually got a resolution passed there that dealt with this issue, among many other issues in security and disarmament. But in the U.S., I think it's just going to be a little bit slower. We've put the book together primarily to kind of get all those source materials in one place, and there's 300 sources quoted, most of them military and academic, mainstream media reports, even congressional reports. And so I think that's sort of the first step, and then an assessment of the state of the technology, and then hopefully enough interest in seeing a political solution, because technology is changing so rapidly, and that yet the area of personal privacy is not being maintained in the advent of not just these technologies, but many related to privacy and personal liberty in the 21st century.
Nick, what do you think about the recent numbers over the last decade, the increase in numbers of people that have been getting cancer, different forms of cancer, brain tumors, and the such? I'm hearing conversations about those things being linked to cell phones and Wi-Fi, as we'll talk about later on the broadcast. What is your take on that in terms of technology impacting the human body?
Yeah, absolutely. All these things do. I think there's a combination of things, not just electromagnetic fields, and cell phones in particular, as they relate to brain tumors. You're going to see like Cochrane and some of these other guys that are on cell phones all the time. You're going to see that pretty predominant. I think you're going to see more of it. You're going to see it on the side of the head that their phone was generally on, which usually is one side or the other with most people. But Electromagnetic field effects are just becoming more widely understood in the West. I think they've been understood in Eastern Bloc countries for many years. Whether they applied that knowledge, in terms of safety was another question. They certainly had the restrictions. But I think here in the U.S. it's just going to be a slower pull. It's stuff you don't see. You don't see this kind of energy. When you overlay that with 2,500 new chemicals being introduced that are usually not fully tested for their interactive effects, much less their effects when you interact them with electromagnetic field effects. And there's so much in this area. When you look at cancer, stress-related disorders, the systems, the human beings, all of us are stressed in numerous ways, all of which weakens our immune system and makes us susceptible to all kinds of things that normally we might ignore, or our body might be strong enough to ignore.
Nick, a couple weeks ago I had Dr. Robert Duncan on the program, and we were talking about this very same issue. I think this is defining what it means to be a human being, at the very least in terms of consciousness.
Yeah, and actually, this is the root of what much of the mind control research of this government and many others, I think what they discovered, everyone wants to talk about mind control, controlling people, but ultimately it was what they discovered about human consciousness in terms of what we reach capable of. And I think that scared, I think it scared them, because human beings are capable of much, much more. And occasionally, people pop up that demonstrate these anomalous human capabilities, but they're probably capabilities we all have if we could just learn to master our neurocircuitry. And there are some things coming that I think will allow for that. That's where ultimately I think the human race is headed, and fear and the anxieties of modern culture actually work against that next evolution that I believe we're sitting on the threshold of.
That's true, and I also recognize that violence has been around since the beginning of mankind. Officially, we've always been at war to some degree, but when I read the papers today, Nick, I read these stories about these extreme violent acts that I don't really remember growing up reading. Stories about fathers microwaving their babies, as was in the news last week, and we read a lot of these stories on a regular basis, and I'm wondering, is there something changing? Is there some sort of aversion within the human mind that sometimes creates a climate within the human mind or the human brain to be more susceptible to a violent act?
Well, that's possible, certainly, but a lot of it is just conditioning. I mean, if you just think of movies of 20, 30 years ago, they were so different than what we're exposed to today. I mean, we're desensitized in a lot of respects to violence, so things that would be horrible 20 years ago were not even considered, rising to the depths of where we go today. And a lot of that is just the way our culture's evolved. But I think, is it possible to, condition people other ways? Yeah, absolutely. There's plenty of research for this, and we cite dozens of U.S. patents, many, many programs. And the thing about the mind is it's such an incredibly powerful thing. Mostly what limits it is our own belief systems and sort of the way in which we developed our wiring. But all that is can be altered. I mean, actually, just like exercising your muscles of the body, you can exercise your brain in ways using new techniques that are evolving rather rapidly to increase and enhance your performance as a person, whether it's being to meditate or rest or get rid of stress, those things that are really important in this century.
Could you continue on that statement, because that's exactly where I was going to ask you next. How can meditation, how can even physical exercise to that degree boost the immune system or boost our consciousness to kind of create this mental, physical, and spiritual, if you will, immune system against this technology?
Well, I think there's some things called frequency following response, where the body locks on to external signals, begins to mirror them. Unless there's a stronger signal in the near vicinity, you tend to lock onto the stronger one. And a healthy body, a healthy mind, and if you look at people who are experiencing positive emotions and so on, you get very coherent signals within the human brain. If you're experiencing stress, worry, fear, etc., and bad diet, which brings on a lot of that too, you see incoherent brain patterns, the kind that don't lend themselves to the higher levels of consciousness, nor to good thinking or creative solutions. And that's, and if you look around, think about it. I mean, we're on orange alert, red alert, all this nonsense all the time coming at us, and you look at, what messages we receive from our commercials about how we smell, how our breath is, all these things that generate fear and anxiety. And, the news, I mean, all of it. There's an awful lot of that, to the point where people worry about the economy, worry about all this stuff. And it really breaks down our capacity to overcome it. And that's the basic biophysics of it. If you take the measurements and look at what's going on, it's very destructive in lots of ways. And we don't really think about it, but it's measurable, which tells us something about turning that ship around. It's really about what we do, how we act, and I say don't succumb to fear, but be much more directed in terms of what we do. Find those issues that are important, begin to act on them with at least the power that we still have, and maybe just a little bit of this can indeed change.
Nick, I want to ask you now, before I let you go, about what you see as far as the future is concerned in the next couple of years. There's been a lot of talk about global warming, and there are different perspectives on global warming, whether it's created by man or whether there's an influence that's actually the sun creating the warming of not only this planet but the rest of the solar system as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we did a video on this about a year and a half ago, and actually the sun is a bigger contributor, and it is heating all the planets right now. The other thing that's not accounted for here is undersea volcanics, which release tremendous amount of energy. 1,200 undersea volcanoes are known, any number of which are erupting at any given time in the bottom of the Pacific. And that's just the South Pacific. When you think about this, we wrote about it in '97, I think, when El Nino experiences were happening, and there were some things happening up here that were counter-cyclic, yet temperatures in the oceans warmed 10 to 15 degrees in one summer. And the only accounting for it could have been exactly what I'm speaking about, because solar radiation hitting the surface of the oceans, most of the heat stays at the surface or dissipates, because as soon as you go right below, the temperature gradient drops dramatically and continues to drop, and heat, of course, rises. Mostly when you think about heat energy being released from within the Earth, 100% of that energy is absorbed. The other things that are occurring is release of huge amounts of methane in the Arctic regions, which are 20 times more powerful than as a greenhouse gas than CO2. And so what you're seeing is a big difference in terms of accelerating cycles based on natural events now being triggered for whatever reason, and I think mostly natural, personally. And I think what we're going to see, if man shut down everything they were doing, which is not realistic and it's not going to happen, you couldn't reverse what's going on. We're maybe adding to that right now, but mostly I think nature is contributing the greatest part of this.
Now, you've been researching the government for a long number of years, including the availability of oil. And there's also a debate about peak oil. And I heard you actually on your first show that you did on RBN. I clicked onto your website just the other day. And this is actually a story that you opened with, the availability of oil in Alaska. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, this is another area that a lot of misinformation, tremendous amounts of oil and natural gas here. We have 450 trillion cubic feet of methane hydrate, another 60 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and they say more oil potentially here than in Saudi Arabia, and yet our pipeline is running at 800,000 barrels a day when it could be running at its peak. It ran 2.1 million. So, most of that oil is exported now out of the U.S. It's a heavier sulfur. Most of the refineries that used to be able to handle it have been changed over. And there isn't enough refining or tanker capacity left in the world to accommodate the oil, even if we could pump it through the pipeline. That's the other bit of this story that's been missed along the way, and that's why everyone's paying so much. It's the world demand and not supply so much. It's just getting it through that refining and shipping corridor, which is too narrow right now.
Nick, with all of these things going on, more and more people are emailing me, and I'm sure they're emailing you as well, asking for real solutions. What is something, what do you usually say to a question like that?
Well, I think it's political right now still. I think we've got, all these elections are revving up 2 years in advance, and it's time to get on the phone and get out a pen, not an email, but a pen, and write the handwritten notes and take material and start getting in front of these guys and pick a few issues, and pick 2 or 3 issues, make those the themes for the next year, and do it. Take 10 minutes a month and do something. And that's all it really requires, and I think it doesn't take that many people to start to get some things on the plate. And I think there are some issues that are worth doing that. with right now, and candidates that the people are thinking about a change. People are unhappy, and both parties have let us down. So let's see who's got a plan. That's what I'd like to see, and I think we need to ask some tougher questions and start to formulate the mechanisms. We need whistleblower laws that protect the public from some of the nonsense we've seen. We need corporate responsibility. We need multinationals to pay their fair share of corporate taxes, which they generally, in many, many cases, have managed to avoid. And there's some things we need to look at along those lines.